Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 15-Minute Devotional published by the Aniana Church of Christ in Aniana, Alabama. We appreciate you logging in each Sunday evening, but please remember that beginning June 6th, we'll be back meeting in person on Sunday nights. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the devotional.
Good evening and welcome to the 15-Minute Devotional hosted here at the Aniana Church of Christ. We really truly appreciate you logging in each Sunday night and being a part of these brief devotionals. We hope in some small way that each time we have one of these lessons, it can benefit you and be something practical that will help you. I appreciate you listening to me and to the other men who have delivered these lessons. And for those of you who tune in regularly, let me just go ahead and tell you, if things go as planned, I truly hope to have a treat for you next week. I've been in communication with a former student of mine from Zambia, Africa, and with the advances in modern technology, we've been able to send messages and even some videos back and forth. And if all goes as planned, next Sunday night, Brother Josiah Messiah from Livingstone, Zambia, will be presenting the 15-minute devotional. He's in the process of putting some lessons together, sending them to me so that I can edit them into a video. And it'll give us an opportunity to meet him and to see the good work that's still going on in Zambia, Africa, where I've been on a couple of mission trips. We appreciate you logging in and being here again, as I've already said tonight. And let's get into the devotional. Let's talk about the most famous short story that most of us are familiar with. I heard it said one time, or I read it somewhere in a book, that a good preacher tells a story. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It takes the listener on a journey that ends at the foot of the throne of God. For some reason, that statement has resonated with me, and as a good preacher or communicator tells a story. It makes sense, and it sounds very biblical, probably because it is. Matthew chapter 13, verse 34 says, "And in all these things Jesus said to the crowd in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable." Jesus was a master storyteller. As a matter of fact, it's estimated that over 1/3 of his teachings we have recorded are parables. And Jesus did not tell quaint little stories. He used the parable to teach some of the most difficult truths found in all of Scripture. He used the parable of the Good Samaritan to teach about prejudice. He used the parable of the soils that dealt with growth. He used the parable of the laborers in the vineyard dealing with the personality of God. And for tonight, for our lesson, let's look at a story that may be familiar to you. It's found in Luke chapter 15. Beginning in verse 11, it says, "Jesus continued, 'There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had and set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth with wild living. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine, so that the whole country began to be in need. And he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him into the field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will get up and go back to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went back to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to his father, 'I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on, and put shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called to one of the servants and asked him what's going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fatted calf because he is back safe and sound.' And the older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father and said, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and have never disobeyed your orders. You've never gave me even a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours, which was dead, is alive again. He was lost and is now found.'" This has been called the greatest short story ever written because it speaks so truthfully to the human condition. It's really the story of a father with two sons. One sinned when he left, while the other sinned while staying home. In my mind, this story is Jesus' greatest teaching about grace. And maybe the reason that we love this story so much is because our heart tugs to know more about God and to know more about His amazing grace. In our text, there are three main characters, and so often we tend to focus on the son who left. But tonight, let's look at the other two characters. You see, I believe this is not so much a story of the son who left, but a story of the son who, of the grace of God and the way we react to that grace. In our story, we see a young man who thought he knew better. He thought that he was being held back in his father's house, following his father's rules and trying to live up to his father's expectations. Maybe his struggle was not with his dad, but with his older brother. Whatever the reason for needing to get out, the younger son demands the unthinkable. I want my inheritance and I want it now. This was the equivalent of saying, Dad, I'm ready for you to be dead. Normally, a father in this situation would kick his kid out of the house for making such an unthinkable request, and even had the right under the old law to stone him. You would expect the father to refuse a request like this, but remember that the father in this story is God, and He acts differently than we act. The father knows that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them go. So taking the money, the boy leaves home and journeys to a distant country where he spends every dime he had on wild living. When a famine comes, not having any cash and being too far away from home, he attaches himself to a farmer who says, the only work I have for you is feeding my pigs. He had eaten prime rib just a few weeks earlier, and now he's dining in the pen with the swine. In the end, he had lost everything and he hits rock bottom. God often lets that happen because many of us won't look up until we start to eat with the pigs. When we finally reach the end of our rope, then and only then do we begin to think about returning home again. So the boy gets up and he heads home. Now I would imagine that as this boy shuffled along the road, a couple of questions went through his mind, like, what is my father going to say? Will he take me back? With his head down, he walked along that dirt road, embarrassed, humiliated. Certainly his fears were well-founded. We don't often think about the father's pain when we read this story, but it couldn't have been easy for him. I mean, he lost part of his fortune that he had worked so hard and longed to amass. Not to mention what must have happened to his reputation in the community. When a son leaves home in such anger, there's no way to keep it hidden. But the worst pain was the simple fact that the father had lost his son. After all these years and all those prayers, after holding him in his arms and teaching him how to hunt and fish and pouring an ocean of love upon him, suddenly the dream is shattered. The father's left with a huge hole in his heart. Words can't express the pain, the sadness, the loss the father feels. His son is left home and no one can console him. And after all that, could anyone blame the father if he refused to take his son back? No wonder the son worries as he slowly plods towards home. He has absolutely no idea what awaits him. Verse 20 says that while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. Day after day, night after night, he waited for his return. Nothing deterred him, not the weather, not the jeers and jokes of the skeptics, not the doubting looks of his friends. Deep in his heart, he knew that someday he would come back home. Then it happened. One day he saw a figure walking hesitantly towards him. Throwing all dignity aside, he ran to meet his son, embraced him without ever saying a word, threw his arms around him, hugged him, and kissed him. The father knew full well how his son would be welcomed in the village when he returned in failure, so he prepared a plan. He would run to meet the boy before he reaches the city limits. If he's able to reconcile with his boy in public, no one will be able to treat his son badly. In that one moment, all questions are answered. The son's fear melted away in the tears and the hugs. No words passed between them, but one broken heart spoke to another, and the father gave his greatest gift, and that was his grace. But not everyone in the story was interested in giving grace and mercy. We need to remember who Jesus is talking to when he shared these three parables. In verses 1 and 2, we see who had gathered to listen to him. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around to hear him, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. You can almost feel the tension here, can't you? Jesus likes to spend time with the worst kind of people, and it bothered the self-righteous people, the religious people. They wanted him to spend time with good people. It's their benefit, and sadly ours as well, that Jesus introduces the older brother. The older brother represents all those right-thinking, right-living, rule-keeping people who want to see sinners publicly punished to teach them a lesson. Just as the prodigal son still lives today, so does his unhappy older brother. The older son is working in the field when the younger son returns, and he doesn't know about it until after the party has already started. There's something about hard work that seems to awaken a self-righteous attitude within us, and there's something about putting forth effort that makes us look down on those who don't put forth the effort. One of the servants tells him that his brother has come home, and his father is exceedingly happy about it, and this news is met by an immediate expression of jealousy and anger. He begins to sulk and pout like a little boy, and he refuses to go into the house. When the father comes out to urge him to come in, all the pent-up rage that he has comes boiling out, and it just spills out onto the father with a flood of bitterness. Some of us this evening stand in the shoes of the older brother. Perhaps it would help to look at this a bit so we can see how closely we match up with his three self-righteous tendencies. The first that we sometimes match up with is a sense of being treated unfairly. You never gave me a goat so I could have a party with my friends. He felt like he had been ignored or forgotten. This feeling of unfair treatment is always the initial mark of a self-centered attitude. It's the sign of crushed pride, of wounded ego, of revealing self-centeredness. Its most common expression, as this story begins, is that of anger and won't play attitude. I'm going to take my marbles and just go home. The second thing that we can often characterize ourselves or see that we share with this older brother is an overinflated view of self. Notice how the older brother describes his own worthiness. Notice how he gives himself self-praise. Look at all these years I've been slaving for you. From the older son's perspective, he's just been contributing to the father. He makes no recognition of how much his father has helped him, of how much his father has taught him over the years. And then he says, and I've never disobeyed your orders. I doubt that this is a true statement. No one has ever lived up to that kind of standard. It's remarkable how easily he can conveniently forget about the many times the father had forgiven him over the years. But his view of himself is that of being completely and totally in the right. That's always a mark of self-righteousness. The third mark is his blame of the father and his contempt for the brother. Do you ever notice how he said it there? This son of yours. You can hear the cutting edge of his contempt in that statement. He doesn't say, my brother, or call him his brother. There's no gladness of his return. He looks at him as something vile, something despicable. Also, there's no love or respect for his father. Do you notice how the father ends up with all the blame? It's all your fault. You never gave me a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes home, who has squandered your property, you kill the fatted calf for him. Self-righteousness is one of the world's most deadly sins. Jesus dealt with it more severely and more sharply than any other sin. He could be tender, gracious, and accepting towards those who are involved in adultery and drunkenness, but when he faces the self-righteous Pharisees and their smug complacency, his words always burn and smear. This sin is deadly because it is so easily disguised as something justifiable. That's what's wrong with self-righteous spirit. It can always be proved by the book to be right. There is a sense in which the son can be justified for this attitude, but that's always the mark of self-righteousness. Joseph Stoll has said that the American church is long on mad and short on grace. We're mad at politicians, we're mad at the media, we're mad at the president, we're also mad at those who live their lives differently than we do. We must stop being so angry with people who sin. Lost people are going to sin because they are lost. Christians are going to sin because they're not perfect, and we need to refuse to be angry with people who sin differently than we do. This church must be what Christ longs for it to be, a gathering of place for forgiven sinners. When we're self-righteous, when we think we're better than others, it's impossible to be gracious. We can't be grace givers if we constantly believe that we are superior to other people. We need to remember that we're all equals. We need to remember that there's a party going on and we're going to join it, or we're just going to stand outside and criticize. Now, maybe there's not much joy in your life since it's been a long time since you've come to a party of grace. But notice the grace that the father pours out on the older son in the story. He said to him in verses 31 and 32, my son, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate, be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and now he's alive again. He was lost and he's now found. As we close, let's look very quickly at the two characteristics of God that Jesus shares with us in this story. The first characteristic is that I want you to notice is this. It says that the father, speaking of what he does to the older brother, says the father goes out. He goes out to the returning rebel and to the sulking son. God the Father loves the self-righteous, the smug, the self-centered legalist just as much as he loves the rebellious and the defiant. When the father finds his oldest son, he doesn't scold, berate, or rebuke him harshly, but rather pleads with him again and again, come into the party. The father tells the son that everything he had was available to him, and all he had to do was ask. A self-righteous attitude frequently occurs in those who are sitting in the midst of a great possibility but never claim it. They get very upset when they see others whom they feel are not deserving of anything coming in and getting what they could have had, but they never asked for. They never claimed. This reveals that the older son is actually in a distant country as well. Secondly, the father to the older son offers grace. Not only has he accepted the wandering son, but now he turns to the self-righteous one and says, son, you're always with me, and all that I have is yours. Now don't be angry because I've shown love and grace to your brother. God knows that none of us deserve a relationship with him, but because he is compassionate and full of grace and mercy, he offers us what we don't deserve and can never earn. Jesus ends this story with the boy standing outside the house. We don't know what happens next. Does he stand outside nursing a wounded ego? Or does he repent and go in and join the party? We don't know. Jesus just leaves the ending hanging. I think he does so because he wants us to see ourselves in the story. Which one of the brothers more closely describes you? The Father has enough grace for both of us. He's looking for prodigals and he's looking for proud. He welcomes sorry sinners and he welcomes smug saints. Maybe that's why this is the greatest short story that's ever been told. Because at the very heart of this story, we read about the Father's grace to both sons. And his grace is still available to us tonight. Thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate you logging in every Sunday night. We hope that in some small way this lesson has been helpful. Remember that God's grace is wonderful and amazing, and I hope that you have an outstanding week. We look forward to seeing you on Wednesday night at Bible study. Have a good evening, everyone.